Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get us started here tonight. Thank you everyone for coming. I recognize some faces from the program earlier today at Spring Lake. So happy to see some familiar faces again. But for anyone who this is your first program of this series, this is a 4-part series that we're doing. This is number 2, and there are 2 more tomorrow. The same program will be at the Hackley Public Library in Muskegon. So if you like it and you want to recommend it to somebody. And then we'll have a 4th one that's a totally different program at the Herrick District Library's main branch in Holland. And so those are on these little flyers. They're by the back if you'd like to grab one or like any more information. Otherwise, though, we have tonight a fantastic presenter. His name is Eric Hemenway. As you can see, he was not able to be with us in person tonight, but that is okay. We work around things, we pivot. And so he's with us virtually. And the fun thing is you can kind of see on the bottom of the screen there, he can see all of you. So feel free to wave and say hi. So when we get to our Q&A portion, after he is done presenting, I'll walk around with this mic. And feel free to, if you like, come up closer, or you can stay right where you are, however you would like to do it. So otherwise, without further ado, let me introduce Eric Hemenway. He is an Anishinaabe Odawa. He is the Humanities Manager for the School of Environmental and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. He's a lifelong involvement of researching Odawa history and has collaborated widely with museums, universities, the National Park Service, schools, and various governments in conducting and presenting research to a wide range of audiences, including students, staff, faculty, and the general public. And truly, that is just the tip of the iceberg. Eric is absolutely fantastic. So, Eric, if you would like to go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for having me tonight, and my apologies for not being in person, but life caught up with me pretty quickly with some injuries in the last couple days, actually, and week. So it prohibited me from being down there, but I'm here in a different capacity and very happy to be so to share an important story that not a lot of people know about. And this is Anishinaabe involvement in the Civil War. But before I get started with that, my name is Eric Hemenway. I am Anishinaabe Odawa from Cross Village, Michigan. Most people don't know of Cross Village, but if you do, you definitely know it. And that's where I grew up, and literally a village of about 300 people. Yeah. And it's way more than the Polish restaurant, because when I talk about it, people are like, oh yeah, that place. I'm like, no, let's forget about that place. Talk about the places. Let's talk about the Odawa history of this place. So that's where I'm from. I'm Odawa. And for 20 years, I worked in the tribal archives for the Little Tribes Bay Band of Odawa Indians. And I just recently transitioned from tribal government to academia. So 2 different types of environments. But for 20 years, I was in a tribal archives doing a plethora of different educational initiatives through exhibits, signage, curriculums, programs, worked for litigations on behalf of the tribe. So a little bit of everything is under the purview of Native history. So I consider myself like a kind of jack of all trades, master of none. It's like knowing a lot of different subjects and then not having the opportunity to do the really deep dive on the ones I really want to do. But this one I did a little bit deeper because it's so unique. It's so just a good story. So if anybody knows any movie producers or any, Steven Spielberg types, this is the story. And you'll see why I say that, because it's just got all the elements of just heroes, villains, just really remarkable people doing remarkable things. So it's about Company K. They're in the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters in the Civil War. It's the largest all-Indian regiment east of the Mississippi for the Union Army. And it's a Michigan story. So preface though, I am a little bit biased towards the Northern Michigan Odawa because that's me. So I sprinkle in a little bit more Odawa than the other tribes because that's fair enough to say that it's the other tribe's story to tell their part of it. So, but I'm telling the Odawa part of it. So without further ado, I'm going to try, Chelsea, again to share. I'm scared. We pulled it off.
I'll let you know if it doesn't work out.
All right. So Company K, the Union Army's largest all-Indian regiment east of the Mississippi. And another preface, I use the term Indian quite a bit. It's a legal term. and it's written into the Constitution, it's written into laws, treaties, executive orders. So in that regard, that's why I use it. So if you're quite, I get asked all the time, like, why do you keep using that word if you're not talking about people from India? Fair question, because it is a legal term. So in that frame, I use it, but I prefer to be Odawa. So who was Company K? Oh, Company K was part of the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters, and it was comprised of the Odawa, also known as Ottawa, Ojibwe, also known as Chippewa, and Potawatomi, also known as Potawatomi. There was 139 Anishnaabek soldiers in Company K, and 43 died from diseases or wounds, which, given the history of the Civil War, this is a pretty good survival rate for the company. It was predominantly an Odawa company by 51%. I forgot to put it, 36% were Ojibwe, 8% Potawatomi, and 5% unknown, but probably Odawa or Ojibwe. And part of the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters, and they're primarily from the lower peninsula of Michigan. There was a couple Upper Peninsula folk, a couple Yoopers in Company K, and one guy from Walpole Island over in Canada, but it was predominantly a lower peninsula population that made up Company K. So this is a map of the different communities that Company K came from across the state of Michigan. And you can see just a real wide representation of the Lower Peninsula. Lots of people from, Emmett County, Charlevoix, down by Traverse City, then somewhere closer to you guys in Pentwater and Grand Rapids for sure. And we're going to talk about a very special individual from the Pentwater area. All of the Potawatomi people are coming from Van Buren County, or from Van Buren, Kalamazoo, and then Jackson. We had a few individuals, a couple by Detroit. There's our Canadian from Walpole, and then just a small handful of guys coming from the Upper Peninsula. So it's predominantly a Lower Peninsula community or company, but the majority of individuals came from Northern Michigan, especially places like Cross Village, Little Traverse, which is Harbor Springs. Mackinac had a lot of guys, as Charlevoix and Traverse City. So this is where Company K was coming from in the 1860s. So what makes the story of Company K so compelling, and my interpretation of this, is why would you fight? Why would you fight for the Union? Why would you fight for the United States? That to me is the question that really makes this such a dynamic story, such a compelling story, and a complicated story. So the years leading up to the Civil War, through the lens of the Michigan Anishnaabek, not every tribe, definitely not talking about out west or east on the East Coast. We're talking about here in the Great Lakes. So leading up to the war, the Anishinaabe fought against the Americans in the War of 1812. So the vast majority of Great Lakes tribes during this war sided with the British, or I like to say the British sided with us, against the Americans for 3 wars. The first war was a Revolutionary War. We fought against the Americans, and we fought against the Americans in Little Turtles War of 1790 to 95, and then one more time in the War of 1812. So Great Lakes tribes were coming out in force to maintain lands, their way of life, resources, all the above. So after the War of 1812, things changed very, very drastically and very quickly for Michigan's Anishinaabek communities. The war concludes in 1815, and pretty quickly, in terms of political movement, the Indian Removal Act is signed in 1830. So this is a federal law that removes Native peoples from east of the Mississippi to west of the Mississippi, and it did just that. So hundreds of thousands of Native people were forcibly removed based on their race to Oklahoma, Kansas. And the tribes in Michigan, for the most part, avoided Indian removal through some very clever and direct treaty negotiations with the United States. So that's a whole nother program and presentation unto itself. But it's important to note that these very, very important and very complicated negotiations were happening right up to the Civil War. So the major treaties for Northern Michigan, where I'm from, are 1836 and 1855. And these treaties kept my community in Michigan, essentially, because we were slated for removal to Kansas in 1838. Potawatomi were hunted down and removed near Battle Creek, near Kalamazoo. So Indian removal was happening in our own state. It's just not talked about a lot in the public discourse and public education. It's usually the Georgia Cherokee story, which is a real story, but Indian removal did happen here. So that's happening, and that's the Union Army. This isn't the Confederates. So the United States is moving people out, sending them out west, immense amount of suffering and difficulty. So we're making negotiations, treaties to stay home. This removal is affecting every single tribe in the United States. It's either you are removed, or how do you avoid removal? What steps do you take to stay home? And these are very drastic steps. So the removal policies of Andrew Jackson are in full effect. There's social and civil rights of the Anishnaabek that are being diminished at this point, and loss of land, natural resources, and drastic changes to our Anishinaabe way of life are all happening right up to the Civil War. So all of these things are happening real time, which makes the question, why would you fight for this country that are doing these things to you? So political cartoons are still a big thing, but in this time period, they were a very big thing. And this is a political cartoon from the Andrew Jackson administration, just showing that the tribes are like infants. They're unable to take care of themselves. They're like babies and children. And the president, the great father, the great white father, was there to help them, bring them into a state of civilization, into a state of prosperity. So there's a lot of spin going on. That this image is showing that we are unable to take care of ourselves, which we've been taking care of ourselves on this continent for over 10,000 years. But in the eyes of the government, is that what you're doing isn't working, it's wrong, it's uncivilized, it's savage. We're here to take care of you. So this is the political, social, and economic climate that Michigan's Anishnaabek are dealing with leading up to the Civil War, being second-class citizens in their homes, being disenfranchised. We were not U.S. citizens. At this point, we would not be U.S. citizens until 1924 with the Indian Citizenship Act. We're the last population to receive U.S. citizenship. So this is creating a lot of barriers for land ownership, legal rights, court rights, voting rights, obviously. So all of this is in play, where we are in this really fuzzy gray area of what are the Indians? Who are the Indians? Are they citizens? Are they domestic wards? And this question isn't fully answered to this day, but it was even more murky in the 1830s and 40s leading up to the Civil War. So this is what we call the Royce map. It's developed by Charles Royce for the Bureau of Ethnology for the United States. This is a federal map, and this map shows different colored areas of the state of Michigan. And each colored area represents what we call ceded or sold lands by certain groups of tribes to the United States. So we hear this term treaties all the time. It's a very complicated story. That's a whole nother talk unto itself. But it's important to note that the tribes were engaging in government-to-government negotiations called treaties with the United States leading right up to the Civil War. So these treaties have different stipulations. They reserve different rights for the tribes that are signatories to them. Not every treaty applies to all the tribes. It's very specific. So on this map, it shows how I think Michigan became Michigan. You know, all these massive chunks of land that groups of tribes as joint signatories to these treaties sold to the United States in order to avoid removal to Kansas and Oklahoma. That's the context for this map, is to stay home. So on the very western end of the UP, the Teal area by Keweenaw Bay and Porcupine Mountains in Copper Country, that is the LaPointe Treaty of 1842. It's exclusively an Ojibwe treaty of the Ojibwe tribes out there, and then also in eastern Wisconsin. And then you come east of that into this large yellow area, the eastern UP, and about a third of the Lower Peninsula. That is a Treaty of Washington, D.C., 1836. That's the largest land cession treaty of all the Michigan treaties. It's about 16 million acres. 6 different tribes signed that treaty. Grand Rapids, Little River or Manistee, Grand Traverse, Little Traverse, Mackinac, Sault Ste. Marie. We go down into the pink area in the middle of the state. That's the Treaty of Saginaw. There's only a few Odawa tribes that signed that. It's predominantly an Ojibwe Chippewa treaty. The green area down in Southeast Michigan is the Treaty of Detroit. It's Odawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe that signed that. And then the Teal area in southwestern Michigan is the Treaty of Chicago that's predominantly Potawatomi. So different tribes sign all these different treaties. Doing so in order to stay home, avoid removal, to reserve rights to the lands that they ceded, hunting, fishing, gathering, cultural use, and to receive some assistance to transition into this new American way of life. So these treaties are all happening very quickly, very rapidly, right before the Civil War. So without the treaties, I would probably be talking to a group in Kansas, talking about how we got pushed. But because of the treaties and the leadership, I am talking in Michigan and how we stayed. So the treaties are both ways. There's some good to it, but there's definitely some not so good. But given the context of what was going on at the time, removal, this is what you had to do to stay home. So this is another Royce map. And out of all these treaty negotiations, this is what the tribes retained as land bases. These are called reservations. So the little pink areas that you see on the map are the reservations from the various treaties. So you go from the late 1700s to having use, control, ownership of the entire state. And then within one generation, you are in these reservations. Now you have access to that ceded territory, but that ceded territory becomes populated very quickly, limiting access to things such as food and water and natural resources. So these reservations vary in size. And it's not like the reservations we think of like out west and North and South Dakota and in Arizona, New Mexico, very large open spaces. Our reservations are very, very small compared to those, but at least we have them and they kept us home. So all of this is going on right before the Civil War. So we had our own wars we fought against the United States, and then we had, I consider these legal wars in order to stay home through these treaties. And then all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose with the Civil War. So right up until the Civil War, the tribes, I believe, are going to fight for their rights, try to stay home, but then the Civil War breaks out, and I really feel like the tribes we're saying we're gonna wait and see how this plays out. They're fighting against each other now. And this isn't just a squabble or a skirmish. This is all-out war between the North and the South. And a lot of tribes were sitting on the sidelines, but some did join immediately, especially in the South. The Confederates mustered in a lot of Cherokee, Cree, Choctaws pretty quickly. They needed manpower, but the Union wasn't going to do that. They didn't let any natives muster in until 1863, after heavy, heavy losses at multiple battles. They needed people. But in 1861, the Odawa and Ojibwe were denied. They tried to join, but they were denied. There's a huge amount of resentment, prejudice, like stereotypes against Native people. They're untrustworthy. They're savage. They go blood crazy in battle. A lot of guys who are fighting in the Civil War, their dads probably fought against these Native people in the War of 1812. So I think a lot of that baggage is carrying over. But they're allowed to enter in 1863. During this whole time, tribes are trying to renegotiate new treaties with the Union to have stronger title to their lands, to protect resources. Citizenship with stipulations was a conversation. So in order to get citizenship at this time period, as a U.S. citizen, you could, as a Native person, get this if you renounce your tribal citizenship, join the military, or if you are female, marry a non-Native. But that would not guarantee that your kids were citizens. So there was these weird, quirky loopholes for Natives to get citizenship, but they're very loaded, very racist. Most tribes weren't willing to do all these things. They wanted an equal footing in an ethical way. And also with the struggle for equality, the restrictions to hunting, fishing, and gathering on the lands. So all of this was going on up to the Civil War, during the Civil War, and out of this, Company K musters. So why fight? Public opinion is not favorable of Indians at all during this time period. We are being disenfranchised from our lands. Not an Indian fight. That's a very valid question. Good question to have. It is and it isn't. But we also have the history of warriors, that some men joined because they thought it was an honorable fight to end slavery. Monetary gains, for whatever reason, I haven't figured this out, that Native soldiers in the Union got equal pay to white soldiers. So there was that. And then there was the political and social implications. They were trying to renegotiate some of these treaties, trying to get citizenship. So maybe if we fight this fight, that'll help our political causes and just the overall equality of being here in the United States. So these are from some newspapers at the time. And this is from the Detroit Free Press of May 14th, 1861. A project was started in the legislature of Lansing last week, which was very fortunately nipped in the bud. For arming and equipping a regiment of Indians at the expense of the state to be used in the war, every man knows the system of warfare adopted by these demi-savages, and the civilized people of the northern states will hardly consent this year to become responsible for the performance of such allies. All these projects of employing either Indian or Negro troops cannot be too strongly reprobated, and their actions cannot be subjected to too great a degree of public scorn. And this is a couple years later, the year that we were mustered in, Detroit Advisor and Tribune, 1863. As a race, they, the Indians, have not yet reached that degree of civilization which should entitle them to all the rights and place on them all the responsibilities of citizenship. Very few of them can read. Any by far the greater portion neither speak nor understand our language. At the best, they are but semi-civilized. They are a poor, ignorant, independent race. So this is what not just Company K is dealing with at the time, but all the Anishinaabe people in the state of Michigan. Yet they join. So as I got deeper into Civil War history, I quickly realized Civil War historians are a different type of historian. They are very focused on what they do. And as I got into this research, it's just the numbers were just staggering of how many people would die in these battles in a couple days. And Gettysburg is just, it's astounding that nearly 50,000 people would die in a couple days in one spot. So just these numbers of casualties. And Company K knows about this. Nobody's ignorant of what's going on. You know, word is going back home. People are, talking, they're reading the newspapers, they're getting these updates. Company K knew what they were getting into, yet they were denied entry and they kept trying. So the first several battles they did not fight in, but once they joined, they fought in some very pivotal battles down in Virginia. This was some of the turning points for the war. Spotsylvania, they were at the Wilderness, and these are major campaigns that Company K was there fighting at. So they didn't sit on the sidelines. They did not wait until the battle had been fought, then coming through late. Sharpshooters were the tip of the spear. They were skirmishers. They were sometimes the first people into battle because of their abilities to shoot fast and far. So Company K was often right in the mix, the first ones to engage. And they were in some of the, I said, like very pivotal battles during the war. So the crater it lives in infamy with Civil War histories of mismanagement, blunders, missed opportunity, kind of what the hell were you thinking? All of this applies to the crater. And at the siege of Petersburg, there was a stalemate. The North and the South stared at each other across a big field for months. Nobody could break the stalemate. And the Union decided, in order to break this stalemate, we are going to employ a regiment from Pennsylvania, because they're miners, they know how to dig safely, and we're going to dig a giant tunnel under the field and go underneath the Confederates and then pack it full of explosives once we get there and light the fuse. So that's exactly what they did. They dug a tunnel for weeks, months, And they were successful. They got underneath the Confederate lines. From what I understand, the Confederates could hear them doing something, but it was unfathomable that somebody would dig underground and do anything. And they dug, they planted the explosives, they lit the fuse, and they went boom in a big way. So this photo was from after, obviously, and you could just see, it looks like a bomb had been dropped. And from the accounts, debris went into the air and was in the air for minutes. Total disarray. They met the objective, but through mismanagement, they did not take advantage of the element of surprise. There was miscommand, there was misorganization. They did not rush through immediately. And by the time the Union had been organized and went forward, the Confederates regrouped. And as mismanagement would have it, they sent all of the African American soldiers from New York and all of Company K into the crater. And this became the proverbial turkey shoot, shooting fish out of a barrel. The Confederates had the high ground, and they just rained fire down onto the Union soldiers in the crater. And from various accounts, the blood was several inches deep in the crater. It was a slaughter. And amongst all of this chaos and carnage, several Company K guys were mortally wounded. They knew they were not going to make it out of the crater. And amidst all of this chaos, they huddled up in a small group, put their shirts, or what they call blouses back in the day, over their heads, and they started to sing their death song in their native language. Men from the Confederates and the Union both took note of this in different diaries and recollections, saying the Indians in the crater were singing. They're singing their song. They know they're not going to make it. And then one of the Company K guys that did make it out, his name is Antoine Scott. He's from Pentwater. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor not once, but twice. And he was recommended for his bravery at the crater. He was one of the last guys to leave the crater. And he was providing cover and fire, not just for his Company K comrades, but other Union soldiers. So the crater, for a lot of Civil War historians, is very well known. And during the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, I got to go do a program at Petersburg. I went to the crater. It's not this big anymore. It's kind of a divot. And I was like, well, where's the crater? And they're like, well, you're here. Through development, mismanagement again, but they preserved what they could. But then it was very surreal to be standing in hollow ground and being in a place where my ancestors had fought, many others, and given their lives. So it was a very special moment for me. And they asked if I wanted to come back the next day they were going to do a ceremony at the very moment the first shot was fired at like 5:40 a.m. And I said, I'm not that hardcore of a historian. I'll be here, for my program at 9 a.m. But by that time, it was flooded. Thousands of people were there. And it was pretty, like I said, surreal. So our guys were there fighting with many other guys. So the crater is part of this story. Like I said, if you know somebody who does production, movies, Netflix specials, this is part of the story. So some guys were killed in the crater, but some made it out. And some of the guys that made it out of the crater ended up at Andersonville, which is the most infamous Confederate war prison in all the country. So Andersonville was often compared to concentration camps, death camps. Thousands of Union soldiers were put up in Andersonville down in Georgia. And several Company K guys were captured at Petersburg. A couple were in the crater. They make it out of the crater, get captured by the Confederates, and they get sent down to Andersonville. And once upon arrival to Andersonville, they're not treated very kindly by their fellow Union soldiers. There's a group called the Raiders at Andersonville of Union thugs, basically soldiers, like a gang. And they're going through and harassing newcomers, even though they're Union soldiers. But because Company K guys were Indian, they got even more harassment. So these Raiders come up, they want their clothing, they want anything on them of value. And the Company K guys are not having it. They form a circle back to back, and they fight their way out of this attack and kill a couple of the Raiders. From then on, nobody messes with them, but then they succumb to the conditions of Andersonville. Malnutrition, starvation, disease, the elements. And 2 or 3 of our men die at Andersonville, and they're buried down there. But a couple of guys do make it out of Andersonville. 2 of the guys that make it out of Andersonville, they make it out of the crater, or at Petersburg, they make it out of Andersonville. 2 of these guys from northern Michigan, they get on a boat called the Sultana. That lives in infamy for a lot of reasons. It's the worst maritime disaster in American history. And it's all going up the Mississippi. Long story short, it's mismanagement again. They put too many people on this boat. It's not taken care of, and it blows up, and approximately 1,800 people die.
Wow.
These guys survive it. They jump off the boat, it explodes, they swim to shore, and they make their way back home to northern Michigan. So you can't make this stuff up. Like to fight in the battles, to survive Andersonville, survive the Sultana, and then make it back to northern Michigan. One of the guys is from Burt Lake in northern Michigan. The other guy's from Charlevoix. So it's like the Odyssey, that these guys just go through this stuff just to try and get back home. So a couple of our guys are buried down at Andersonville. It's on my bucket list to go pay my respects to them at this point, but they were there. So some of the guys, the warriors, Daniel McKeownagh, he was an actual chief, like a bona fide chief, not just a chief in name. He's from a place called Petoskey, but the original name is Bear River. Now, the numbers might be inflated a little bit. This was the newspapers at the time, but it was reported that he killed 32 rebels, and many of them officers, at the Battle of the Wilderness. He died from wounds at the battle. Again, we talked about Antoine Scott. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor twice. He survived the war, but he never received his medal. And then Garrett Graveret, he was Ojibwe, Odawa German. He was the only Indian officer in Company K. He did not have to join. He was a school teacher in Harbor Springs. He was a musician. His family was wealthy, but he did join, and he died at Spotsylvania at 23 years old, and he's buried on Mackinac Island.
Whoa.
So this is Chief Nakkichickfani. He's a Saginaw Chippewa, and he gives a rousing speech in Detroit in 1863 as they're going to muster. We are descendants of braves, united with our younger brother, the Odawa, and drove the powerful tribes now beyond the great river from these our once beautiful hunting grounds. And the chief went on also to say, if the South conquers you, you'll be slaves, dogs. There will be no protection for us. We shall be driven from our homes, our lands, and the graves of our friends. So this gives some insight as to why they joined. You know, obviously there was a fear of becoming a slave, of being driven out. All of this plays into why these guys joined. So that's an actual photo of Garrett Graveret, the only native officer in Company K. His father, Henry, joined with him, and they both died in battle. And he is buried at St. Anne's Cemetery in Mackinac Island along with his dad. This is Payson Wolf. He is from northern Michigan, and I believe he's originally from Pentwater. And this is their first detail as Company K was watching. It was a Union prison camp of Confederate captives in 1863 at Camp Douglas in Chicago. So a lot of the guys had their photos taken there, and it was a real, from my understanding, a real spectacle, you know, to see. For one, a lot of people didn't think there was any Indians left east of the Mississippi, that all of a sudden here's all these Indians part of the Union Army. So when they would come into town, come into any of these, you know, public places, people would just come to see the Indians. And so Payson was part of that group, and he would survive Spotsylvania. He was also at Andersonville, and he survived Andersonville, came back to northern Michigan, and he settled at my hometown of Cross Village, and that's where he is laid to rest. So this is the only known picture of Company K in the field, and this is outside the Battle of the Wilderness. And I think the caption is just like Michigan Indians. So we know it's Company K, and we don't know exactly who the guys are. But one of the guys, I suspect the one standing to the right of the tree is Big Tom. So Big Tom was kind of the enforcer for the company. So when guys would get out of line and either try to run away or have too much to drink, which happened with all Civil War soldiers, he would correct them, so to speak. So Big Tom was from Saginaw. He was a Chippewa, Ojibwe, and that tree is still standing down in Virginia. And I did get to see the tree on my visit, and it's huge, of course, at this point. But that tree is still there. There's a special name for it that I'm drawing a blank on, but that tree is still there. So it's one of my dreams to go do a program on Company K by the tree, have the picture blown up, and try to identify some of these guys. But that's another project for another day. So this is Francis Tabash. He is Odawa from Cross Village. He survived the war, obviously, comes back home, and like many guys, he goes right back to work, farming, blacksmith, carpentry, working. A lot of guys did not receive the hero's welcome. And ironically enough, as the war was ending, Union soldiers were promised land. And by this time in northern Michigan, land was becoming very scarce. And they were actually giving land on reservations to white Union soldiers. So it's a real twist. A lot of these guys go and fight for the Union. They come back home and they lose their land to another Union soldier. That wasn't the case for Francis. He was able to retain his land. That's his allotment. That's his selection under the reservation in 1855. And the woman on his left is his wife, and the woman on his right is his daughter. He was part of the GAR. He was very active in veteran affairs for Union soldiers, native and non-native, up in northern Michigan. And he was a bit older when he mustered. I think he was in his late 40s.
Wow.
So he joined late. And his daughter on the right, I'm forgetting her name, but she made quilts, and her quilts are at the Michigan Historical Center. And so we have these, I call them Company K quilts because they're made in that home from a daughter of Company K, and they have some of her quilts. And they also have, the Michigan Historical Center has, they're known for their flags, and they rotate them out, but they have one of Company K's last flags. So it's really cool to see, and they have all the different engagement battle sites sewn onto these flags. And it's all tattered and shot up and burned and so on and so forth. So they actually have one of Company K's battle flags. I believe this is Joe Showman, Company K guy, much, much younger. I think he was 17, 18 when he mustered, and he's buried in Harbor Springs. And this is John Showman. So a lot of Showmans joined, and he's also buried in Harbor Springs. So we go into the war, we fight bravely, we fight in the big battles. When Petersburg fell, that was the end of the war, essentially. And it was within days that the South surrendered. And once Petersburg fell, the Michigan sharpshooters were some of the first into the city to raise the American flag. So Michigan sharpshooters, maybe it's possible that an Indian was there raising the flag. I'm not ruling it out. I can't confirm it, but I like to ask the question. It reminds me of like Iwo Jima, with Ira Hayes. He's one of the guys raising the flag at the top of the mountain. So there's that legacy of Native warriors raising those flags after difficult battles. So I'd like to keep hope alive. Maybe I'll find a record someday that says that. But until then, I'll speculate. The war concludes, but for Native people, we will still have some pretty sizable struggles, I'll put it that way, that we would fight back home. Like I mentioned, we would not be citizens of the United States until 1924. Technically, the guys at Company K could not vote in federal elections. That says a lot when you go and fight and give your life for a country. Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 was also called the Indian New Deal. It granted tribes more sovereignty, more control over the lands, greater economic development. Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. We're the only race to have a law that said you can practice your religion openly in the United States, and it's really, really late. 1978. In 1863, it was illegal for Indians to practice their traditions and beliefs. A lot of people were being arrested and having their ceremonies destroyed, broken up. That's all happening with Company K when they're mustering. We have the Indian Child Welfare Act. We have the Native American Graves Protection Act. These are all laws and acts to create more equality across the board for Native people. So Company K fights, they fight bravely, but it'll take nearly another century for a greater level of equality to be brought across not just Michigan tribes, but tribes across the United States. So when Company K specifically comes back home, what is going on? So that one guy that I mentioned who survived the battles, Andersonville, the Sultana, his home community of Burt Lake, that's where he's from. He goes back home. 40 years later, he's probably passed by this time, but his kids are alive. In 1900, his community is burned out by a land speculator and local sheriff. The land goes up for sale for back taxes. The tribe contests it, saying we don't have to pay taxes on a reservation. It doesn't hold. The land is sold to a speculator. The speculator brings basically a posse with the local sheriff, evicts all of the Odawa, some 300 to 400 Odawa from their homes. And to add insult to injury, he goes to each cabin, douses it with kerosene, and burns it to the ground. So this is, one generation after the Civil War. I just mentioned a lot of Civil War veterans come and squat on Indian lands in northern Michigan. A lot of Company K veterans have to fight to have their pensions honored, and there's no parades. There's no heroes welcome when they make it back. But they do fight, and they fight bravely, and they fight as a unit. They fight just like all veterans. It's a really, I think, encouraging story that doesn't get told quite often or hardly at all. And I'm very proud that these guys fought. I know it's a complicated story and why they chose to do so, but I'm glad that they did, because I believe that what they did was to create a better future for Odawas, Ojibways, and Potawatomis in the state of Michigan, which I think did happen eventually. And just to show that, it creates this idea of belonging. And to this day, this holds true. Native Americans have the highest participation in the armed forces of any race. It's not even close. About 7 to 8% of our populations are in the armed forces. And that number is really significant when you look at that Native Americans are 1% of the population in the United States. That's it. So we're 1% of the population, but from our 1%, 8% of us are in the armed forces. And a lot of this stems back to the Civil War. So other states had other natives join, Wisconsin, New York. I think Minnesota had some, but nothing's quite like Company K. It was the largest. And with that, I am going to stop sharing.
Oh.
Wow.
All right, there, figured it out. So that's a little bit about Company K, and happy to try to answer some questions if you have any.
Yeah, I've got a Grand Haven question. In the Sully Walker's book that you did the great foreword to. One of the recurring characters is William Duvernay, who was a drummer boy from Grand Haven and buried in the cemetery here. Does that ring a bell at all?
Can you say the name again real quick? I couldn't hear you.
William Duvernay.
Oh, DuVernay.
Duvernay, that's it, right.
Yep. Yeah, it rings a big bell. Yep.
From Grand Haven?
Yeah, he was. Well, the majority of the DuVernay families from Little Traverse in northern Michigan, but I mean, people moved around. That's where he was when the war started. And yeah, when I was at the 150th anniversary for the Civil War, one of the DuVernay descendants was there, Tom. And he's a school teacher in South Korea. And he came all the way across the world for that event. He's Odawa teaching in Korea, but he wanted to be there for that day. So that was really cool to meet up with him. But yeah, DuVernay, that's the family.
Well, he had his body shipped back here to Grand Haven to be buried. So we do have a tie in here.
Yep.
Anything, okay?
I want to say thank you for sharing, but I have a question. Is there any activity to try to get, you said there was one soldier that never got a medal. Is there any trying to get that medal back to his ancestors?
Yeah, there's been a lot of activity around Antoine Scott for years to get a posthumous Medal of Honor to his family. So yeah, it comes and goes. Like I see a big push, every 2-3 years it seems like, and then it kind of fizzles out. So yeah, for sure that there is activity around that to get him his due.
Thank you.
Yes, my great uncle Charles Allen was in Company K.
Yep.
And there's a monument, the Veterans Monument. Oh. I don't know, I just do it. There's a monument at Traverse City in front of the state hospital there with recognizes all the Civil War, Korean War and that. And my guess he'd been my great uncle Charles Allen. He was in Company K.
Yep,
Wow.
I know the name. I've been to the monument, and there's another. Thanks for reminding me. There's a monument right in front of the state capitol.
Oh, there's a road that's going to be for Company K up in Peshavi Town that they're dedicating to Company K.
Oh.
Awesome.
Eric, somewhere along the lines, I saw a video or a documentary on Company K, I believe on public television, maybe about 10 to 15 years ago. It was outstanding. Have you ever run into that?
Yeah, there's been a couple media projects. I think I know what the one you're talking about. There's been a couple. So yeah, the documentaries have been made. The books have been written. It's now we need the high drama TV series. We history people love documentaries, but we got to up our game here and make a Netflix miniseries out of this thing. It's got all the elements.
We have any other questions over here? Oh, wait, wait. It's her first.
I'm wondering if the families in the UP have a time when they gather to honor these veterans and what the celebration is like.
I couldn't quite hear that. It was a little.
I'm wondering if the families of these veterans have a time that they gather together and honor these veterans.
Is there a time where the families of these veterans in the UP or around those areas gather to honor these veterans?
Yes and no. For the 150th, there was some activity, but not on a consistent basis. So that's a great question. I think that's something we could revisit. But a lot of people don't know about Company K. So I think the families know themselves. I go to a lot of talks and people say, my great-great-grandpa, great-great-uncle, but as a whole, a lot of people don't know, the story. So I think people knew the story a little bit more, they might do something.
To get around to more libraries.
I'm trying, yeah.
Thank you for your time. I really appreciate the information. I had a great-great-great-grandfather in the Civil War and Company H. But I had a question. You mentioned Charlevoix. I grew up in Charlevoix, but you didn't mention the person's name of who was connected to Company K that was from Charlevoix.
Oh, I'm drawing a blank. I'd have to go through the list. But Sally Walker's book has a list of everybody, where they're from. That's kind of the book I point to all the time. And she kind of just dropped in my life years ago. And I can't stop people from writing about whatever, but she was like, I'm going to write about Company K. That's your community. Let's have a conversation. So I really appreciated that. And we had a really great conversation. I shared whatever resources we had. And she wrote this really terrific book. I think it's called Deadly Aim. And it's, Amazon, eBay, wherever.
Library.
That's it. At the library, yes, I'm sorry. But you can't own that, for your own use. But she has a very meticulous list of all the people where they're from. So check that out.
All right, thank you.
Or see you back here. I'll go get him and then I'll come back to you, okay?
Attached to Paradise and White Lake with the Michigan Cavalry, with the Schwartz Custer, and it's the Partisan Cavalry. I'm County K was a Michigan unit with militia. Why do you want County K attached to? Unit.
What unit was Company K attached to?
So if I hear that correctly, Company K attached to Custer?
What unit?
No. Unit Michigan.
What unit in Michigan was Company K attached to?
Oh, the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And I forget how many companies there were in the Sharpshooters, but they were part of the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters.
Thank you for being here. I had a question in the list of dates before the Civil War. So 1855 was the Morrill Act that gave land grant to what was called the Agricultural College of Michigan. It's now Michigan State University. And my understanding is that money in land was originally supposed to go to Michigan natives. Can you clarify that, please?
I can't. I don't know enough to make a comment. I don't want to put my foot in my mouth. So I know some elements of that, but I'm not quite certain if that was supposed to go to tribes. So I don't want to put misinformation out there. So I won't answer because I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
I had one more question. What was the typical rifle that they used? What model?
Oh, I think it was a 50 caliber or 54 caliber, but I don't know exactly which make of rifle. But I do know that the Company K guys made their rifles very ornate. They would carve different animals and designs onto the rifle. And some of the guys who saw these rifles just remarked how beautiful they were, that they were like works of art, that these Indians would take all this time to carve in birds and bears and whatnot onto their rifles, and that they were crack shots, that they were some of the best shots in the regiment. And a lot of this was based on because they had to hunt to feed their families. And there was a pretty strict rule to join in Company K. You had to hit a certain size target at like 300 yards, 400 yards with open sights. And you had to hit it repeatedly under time. You had to put so many shots in this circle at hundreds of yards in a couple minutes, reloading and whatnot. And I mean, I try to deer hunt. I have a scope. I have all this stuff. I can't hit nothing. And these guys are shooting open sight, hundreds of yards under duress. and they were just crack shots. And then during the battles, Company K, they would wear, Union uniforms, they're blue. And the Company K guy said, this is kind of ridiculous. So they would roll around in the dirt. They put leaves on their uniforms, and they made camouflage. And the other Union Army guys like, yeah, that's a lot smarter. And they did the same thing. And they also remarked how quickly these guys could move through the woods. They were experts at moving through the woods very quickly, because that's what they grew up doing. So in terms of battle skills, they're very highly skilled. How they could move, how they could camouflage, how they could shoot quickly. And other Union Army guys were starting to replicate them. And one of the guys in the Company K, he didn't have a hand. He was born without a hand. And they said, okay, well, if you can hit the target under time, you could join. And he did. I said, well, we can't stop you. So this young kid, he was like 17, 18. He's like, yeah, I proved myself. So I don't know the exact caliber, but I knew some of the other details about the company. And the big rumor, I should say, or historic gossip, is the rifles of Company K are floating around in these private collections. Like they survived somehow. Like people picked them up off the battlefield or took them because they were so beautiful. So of course it's gossip. I don't know if it's true. I've done different programs and they're like, oh yeah, I seen this Company K rifle. I'm like, it might have been just a nice carved rifle, but that's the rumor.
So if we find one of these carved rifles, we call you, right?
Oh yeah, I just want to look at it. I don't, let me take a peek at it. Let me hold it.
Just kidding. Are there any other questions tonight? I believe that's all of our questions, Eric. Thank you so much again. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.